Hello and welcome to The Magic in You, where I am here with Dr. Andrew Chesnut, who is the Bishop Walter F. Sullivan Chair of Catholic Studies and the Professor of Religious Studies at Virginia Commonwealth University. He is also the author of the first academic book that's been published in English of the first growing new religious movement in the Americas, and the book's entitled Devoted to Death, Santa Muerte, the Skeleton Saint. And it's been translated into Polish, Spanish, Portuguese, French, Italian, and Turkish. He's also the author of Competitive Spirits, Latin America's New Religious Economy, and another book entitled Born Again in Brazil, the Pentecostal Boom and the Pathogens of Poverty, as well as contributing to numerous book chapters, journal articles, and a score of media interviews. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Chesnut to joining me for The Magic in You. Can I call you Andrew?
Of course, yes, you may. Yes, yes.
And thank you for coming on board and talking about the magic in you, Andrew.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for the invitation across a time zone of 15 and a half hours.
You're more than welcome to. Yes, yes. Andrew's in America. I'm here in Australia. So for people who are not familiar with Santa Morte, why don't we just jump right in? Who exactly is she?
Let's see, I have her right here because I'm still old school with show and tell. Here is Aztec style Santa Muerte of the seven powers because she has seven different colors. Um, There are different ways of classifying her, but I think probably the most straightforward one and the one that I use in my book is as a folk saint. Now, Latin America is the largest Catholic region on earth. 40% of the 1.4 billion Catholics on the planet reside in Latin America. And as some of our listeners might know, there are thousands of Catholic saints. By one count, close to 10,000 Catholic saints. Yet the interesting thing here is that there's also a series of folk saints who, in most cases, were real Latin Americans, Latin American, Mexican women, Argentine men, mostly who die prematurely, often gunned down, violent deaths, and a couple years after their deaths, develop a reputation for being miracle workers. And then folks would congregate either at the site of their death or at their grave site and petition them for all sorts of miracles. And so there's scores of these folk saints who are not recognized by the Catholic Church. They're not canonized Catholic saints, yet in many cases, such as Santa Muerte, command greater loyalty than many of the Catholic saints. And part of this is because, as you know, most of the great majority of the Catholic saints are dead Europeans who lived centuries ago and don't necessarily resonate with contemporary Latin Americans. And so there's a greater, cultural and many times social class affinity with these folk saints. So I think that's the best classification for Santa Muerte. She differs, however, from the majority of her fellow Latin American folk saints in that at this point, she isn't associated with any specific Mexican woman. She still is believed to represent death herself, or death itself. I can say herself because 99% of the times she's represented as a female figure. Here we have La Niña Roja, the red girl of Santa Muerte. She is born of syncretism, religious syncretism. The Spanish Catholic Church, as part of the conquest and the colonization of the Americas, brings over the figure of the Grim Reaperess, not the Grim Reaper, because in Spain and in Catholic Mediterranean, more often than not, the figure of death, the figure of Grim Reaper in Northern and Western Europe, was more often than not represented as a female figure, thus Grim Reaperess. So they bring over the Grim Reapers as a tool of evangelization of the indigenous people because in the beginning, the Europeans have no idea who these indigenous people are. Are they, because they're not in the Bible? Are they human? Are they animals? You know, debates rage in Madrid, for example, about this. And you know, they have no idea, for example, that you know some of the indigenous groups have very sophisticated theologies. They have their own deities, for example. And so what happens is that in certain places in Mexico, Guatemala, down in South America, in Argentina and Paraguay, when the indigenous people who already have their own death gods and goddesses see the Spanish Grim Reapers, they make the obvious and natural association with their own death deities. And so that's how Santa Muerte is born, a fusion or a syncretism between the Spanish Grim Reapers and pre-existing death deities. A lot of contemporary Santa Muerte devotees increasingly like to link Santa Muerte to the Aztec death goddess called Mictecacihuatl, who presided as kind of the queen of Mictlan, um, the Aztec afterworld. However, we don't have any historical evidence of that. It's a natural association that believers make today, but that's not really part of the historical record because Santa Muerte first appears in the Mexican historical record in the 1790s in the present day states of Guanajuato and Querétaro, which were not Aztec territory. They're the majority indigenous group are called the Chichimecas. And, you know, they didn't have the same belief system that the Aztecs. So even though many contemporary believers like to make that Aztec goddess association, there's really no historical basis for it.
Very interesting. Thank you very much for sharing that. And I do find it interesting what you said, especially when the Spanish went off and colonized all these creatures. We've had that, we can see that basically all around the world with indigenous peoples and the colonization, where, as you said, it wasn't in the Bible. Who are these people? Even here in Australia, we've had
Of course.
huge issues with, I think it was Captain James Cook announcing that the land was terra nullius. There was no one here. And it's like, well, hello, there definitely was going back, 60,000 plus years.
The oldest, right? The oldest continuing civilization in the world, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so definitely there were people here. But coming back to yourself and Santa Morte and your studies with her, I find it really interesting because in the bio that I shared with everybody, you are a professor of religious studies and a chair of Catholic studies. So how did this interest in this Mexican death goddess saint emerge? What sparked your interest in her?
Yeah, I actually deal detail that in the first pages of my book, and this is actually the new third edition of Devoted to Death, which just dropped last spring with Oxford University Press. So I'm thrilled about that because academic books rarely go to a second edition, much less into a third edition. So what the catalyst for my interest in Santa Muerte was I've been going to Mexico since the early 1980s, not to date myself, but yeah, that's what, 4 decades. My ex-wife is from Mexico City. My wife of 20 years now, again, is from the western state of Michoacan. So I was familiar with Santa Muerte. I hadn't researched her, I hadn't studied her, but I had seen her votive candles and her statuettes in Mexico. Uh, in 2009, I was a couple years into a book project on the Virgin Guadalupe for my third book. For my third book, I wanted to do something of monumental importance because there is no more important advocation of the Virgin Mary than the Virgin Guadalupe. Not only is she Queen of Mexico, she is Empress of the entire Americas, from Canada down to Argentina. No other uh, advocation of the Virgin Mary has such a huge, you know, a hemispheric wide territorial coverage. So I was a couple years into a book project on her and wasn't finding a new angle. I mean, as an academic, you want to do something original, right? And since a fair amount has been written on her, both apologetically by Catholic theologians themselves, and also by social scientists like myself. I wasn't finding a new angle. And then in March 2009, on my old school laptop, I see the news that the Mexican army had gone into the border with Texas and California and had razed some 40 Santa Muerte shrines. I'm like, what? What is that? Why is the Mexican army seeing Santa Muerte as a threat and going in with backhoes and bulldozers? And so I did a quick Google search, which we're not going to be doing anymore with AI, right? But I did a quick Google search and found out that the then administration of Mexican President Felipe Calderon had fingered Santa Muerte as religious enemy number one in his newly ramped up war against the narcos, against the cartels in Mexico, because she already had this association with some of the drug cartels in Mexico. And so that's why she was seen as a threat, basically. And so I thought, wow, that is really fascinating. And I did another Google search and I saw that in Spanish, the academic literature on Santa Muerte was very thin. At the time, there was only one book by a Mexican anthropologist that I think was published the prior year in 2008. And in English, there was nothing. I'm like, wow, this field is wide open. In the context of my research malaise with the Virgin Guadalupe, I consulted with colleagues, friends, family, and within a couple of weeks, I decided to at least temporarily turn my back on Guadalupe and delve into Santa Muerte, trying to explain, how did she become associated with cartels? Why does she seem to be this new religious movement growing so fast? And my goal was to publish the first academic book in English. I imagined I had lots of competition, but another single author book in English only came out like 2 or 3 years ago. So I had no competition. I had no competition for a long time, basically. So that was the catalyst, seeing the news that the Mexican army was destroying her shrines on the border with Texas and California.
So that's really, really interesting, especially and also in today's age where there seems to be a lot of interest in the, can I say, darker, more chthonic, more very earthy deities than sort of pagan or alternative spiritualities. But apart from drug cartels, I mean, even here in Australia, every now and then we see on the news, or she comes to light, and usually it is connected with drugs, or in particular oppressed people, so especially women in Mexico. Being an academic and considering your book now is in the third printer, so congratulations for that.
Thank you.
Why do you have any thoughts as to why people are drawn to her? What does she offer that? Because you said Mexico is very strongly Catholic. What does she offer that other, especially within Catholicism, other saints don't seem to be offering? Is it largely this indigenous connection, or is there something more?
Yeah, that's an excellent question and has kind of multiple answers. Um, the real motor that propels her meteoric growth, and let me say, her new religious movement is not only the fastest growing new religious movement here in the Americas, in the entire world. She really emerges publicly just 2 decades ago. There is no new religious movement that has emerged at the same time that has experienced such astronomical growth. I estimate at least 12 million devotees in the space of just 20 years. To contextualize that, there are only 14 million Jews in the entire world. So the Santa Muerte devotee population is basically the same as the Jewish population in the world. So the real motor that's propelling her growth is her reputation as the speediest and most efficacious miracle worker, particularly on the Mexican landscape. Most of her devotees are working class, have difficult lives. Mexico has been plagued by narco violence for the last 2 decades. I think we're approaching 400,000 violent deaths in the last 15 years. The only countries that exceed Mexico on that type of paroxysm of violence are Ukraine, of course, invaded by Russia, and Syria, where I also have relatives. Um, so, you know, most folks are looking for miracles of protection, of health, wealth, and love. And she had quickly developed the reputation to being the fastest and most efficacious in coming through on those miracles. And so, in that way, that's kind of only indirectly related um, to her stature as a death figure, right? Um, but since she's a folk saint and not a canonized Catholic saint, in fact, the Catholic Church in Mexico condemns her on a weekly basis. Just yesterday, I saw a bishop in the state of Veracruz condemning her. Um, and they particularly do it in October because one of the new trends has been to integrate Santa Muerte into Day of the Dead commemorations, which is coming up November 1st and November 2nd. So, like, starting now, the Catholic Church issues all kinds of admonishments for parishioners not to bring Santa Muerte into their Dia de los Muertos commemorations. Um, but yeah, so we can't so because she's a folk saint and not a Catholic saint, she's basically amoral, not immoral, amoral. And so that gives her kind of an advantage. You can ask her for any type of petition or miracle that you want. So if you need your fentanyl, well, you guys aren't plagued by fentanyl in Australia yet, but if you need your fentanyl, because that's the new drug that's plaguing the United States. If you need your fentanyl shipment to make it safely to, let's say, Atlanta, Georgia, then if you're a narco, you can ask her for that. I don't know if she's going to deliver on that, but you can more easily ask her for that than you should not be asking a Catholic saint for that. I should say there are certain Catholic saints, and I know that cartel members ask for the same thing, but you should not be doing that from a moral and theological standpoint. Whereas since Santa Muerte is a folk saint, you can ask her for anything you want, right? So that kind of gives her an interesting competitive advantage in the religious marketplace. She's open to all petitions. And because ella es la santa que nunca juzga, she's the saint who never judges. She's a non-judgmental saint. So that has made her wildly popular with LGBTQ plus folks, both here in the United States and especially in Mexico. In Mexico, I'd say she's the unofficial patron saint of LGBTQ folks because in such a Catholic country and even here in the United States where there are Republican attempts to repeal same-sex marriage, many folks who are lesbian, gay, transgender, etc., have experienced discrimination, and often in the setting of Christian churches, right? And so Santa Muerte doesn't care about your sexual orientation. She doesn't care about your nationality. She doesn't care about what you do for a living. And so that non-judgmental attitude is really popular with a lot of people who feel like they've been harshly judged much of their lives, right? And so um, a lot of the principal leaders of Santa Muerte, particularly here in the United States, are LGBTQ plus themselves, including Arely Vasquez, the great pioneer in New York City, who's a transgender individual, and many of her fellow devotees in Queens, in the borough of Queens, also are trans. And then they'll say another appeal of Santa Muerte that we can't ignore is she arises at the time of much bad death in Mexico, going back to all the narco violence. And she has two translations of her name into English. One is Saint Death, which but kind of best reflects her status kind of as a folk saint. But it also translates, Santa Muerte also translates as holy death. And so you have this interesting dialectic in which we have the great rise of holy death during a time of so much bad death in Mexico where people are gunned down on the corners of a street, maybe collateral damage as rival cartels are taking AK-47s to each other and such. So we also cannot ignore this socioeconomic, sociocultural context in which she arises at the time of so much horrific death, mostly because of unending narco violence. And of course, the narco violence is fueled by the great demand of consumers of narcotics, chiefly here in my country and secondarily in Europe.
Yes, a perpetual sort of cycle sort of thing that, yes. Well, that's a topic for other people. So I'm finding this really interesting. And I know you've talked about Santa Muerte a lot, but what I want to sort of shift the conversation now before we run out of time is some of your other books as well, like Competitive Spirits. What was the inspiration behind that? And how did you get involved in writing that? And also your first book too, was these also from an academic approach? Born Again in Brazil, were they both academic sort of books, or is it
Yeah, yeah.
something?
All my books are academic books since I'm an academic. The, Devoted to Death is less so since I already was a full professor when I started writing it. I had more latitude to write a book that was kind of less densely academic, and I wanted to appeal to general readers with the interest. And I had never done that before, and I think I achieved a pretty good balance of something that still cuts its teeth academically, but is basically jargon free and yeah, I think I achieved the goal with that. But yeah, my first book, Born Again in Brazil, published almost 30 years ago, 1997. It was coming out right as in the job market when I finished my PhD in 1995. And it was the first academic book in English to examine the Pentecostal boom in Brazil, which is relevant to Australia because I know you recently had a prime minister who was Pentecostal, and you might have only been the second nation to have a Pentecostal prime minister. The first was Guatemala, who had a dictator way back in 1982, 1983. So I spent a year. I got a Fulbright grant, which is under attack now under the current presidential administration, and lived in the Amazonian city, the largest Amazonian city of Belém, because that's where the Pentecostal missionaries from the United States first arrived in 1911, and was looking at why Pentecostalism, or trying to explain why Pentecostalism was booming, particularly in Brazil. And I should tell you today Brazil has the largest Pentecostal population in the world, the largest Catholic and the largest Pentecostal. And so my book is still relevant. I found that so many um, Catholics had converted to Pentecostalism at a time of a health crisis. And Pentecostalism has always been really strong on preaching faith healing. And these were folks who didn't find healing in the Catholic Church, or maybe were unable to afford or access Western the Western medical system in Brazil. And, Pentecostalism essentially preaches, accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior, be born again, and, you'll be cured of your earthly ailments. And so I found that the faith healing to be the motor driving the Pentecostal boom. And then I noticed that while I was doing my research on Pentecostalism, that there was a lot of fierce competition among Pentecostal churches themselves, of the Pentecostals with Catholics, of Pentecostals with the Afro-Brazilian groups such as Umbanda and Candomblé. And I'm like, well, this is a really interesting situation. I mean, this is basically a free market of faith where if you want to grow your religious organization, you need to market it, and you probably need religious products and services that are appealing to people so you can grow your religious organization. And so in my second book, Competitive Spirits, Latin America's New Religious Economy, came out 2003 with Oxford University Press. I look at this religious economy, not only in Brazil and Latin America in general, and I look at the dynamics of religious competition, and I focus on those groups who have prospered the most. And that would be the Pentecostals, of course, Catholic charismatics. There's the largest Catholic lay movement in the world is called the Catholic Charismatic Renewal, and it's basically the Catholic Church's brand of Pentecostalism. And that was actually born in the United States in the late 60s as a way to compete with the Pentecostals. And then I also look at the African diasporan groups, Umbanda, Cuban Santeria, Haitian Voodoo, and see, because, after a long history of repression and having to hot camouflage their faith by associating their spirits with Catholic saints, since for the past 4 or 5 decades, they've been able to come out in the open and be more free with their religious expression. So I examine those groups and try to explain why they are prospering and other groups are not. So yeah, those are my two other books before Santa Muerte came on the scene in 2009.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thanks very much for sharing. And for people who are watching this and are interested in your books, you just say that some of them were published through Oxford Press. Whereabouts can they also obtain them? Are they on through your local bookshop
Yeah, I
or
mean
where?
the easiest place is hegemonic Amazon, right? I mean Amazon is everywhere. Unfortunately, they sell like 85% of all books here in the United States. I know that figure isn't as high in other countries, but that's usually the easiest and surest place to find them because you can also find them in Kindle versions. So yeah, I would recommend, I think it's probably usually easier to go to Amazon if you have an Amazon in your country than it is to go to like the presses, Oxford University Press. My first book was published by Rutgers University Press, which is a state university of New Jersey. So I think Amazon is probably the easiest place to access them.
Right, right, yeah. And another thing, because I know you are pressed for time, do you have any upcoming events, or how can people get in touch with you if they want to learn more or read more about your work? Where can they find you, Andrew?
Yeah, I'm pretty active on social media. Let's see, I'm on Instagram as Dr. Death and Divinity. Yeah, I think that's my handle. I'm on Blue Sky with all the lefties, mostly American lefties. Blue Sky, I think my name's the same there, Dr. Death and Divinity. I'm still on X, formal Twitter, because I do a fair amount of media interviews, and X is still kind of the place to go to access media. There's still a strong kind of journalistic presence there. I'm also on old school Facebook, simply my name, Andrew Chesnut. So those four places, and almost all of my published research and a good chunk of my media interviews are on the site academia.edu. And that's also my name, Andrew Chestnut, I think without the R.
Yep, and I will put all those links below our interview. And do you have any events coming up? Because I know at the time of recording, especially in the Northern Hemisphere, you're coming up to sort of Samhain or the Day of the Dead in early November. Is this something that you involve yourself in personally, or do you just
Yeah, I
ignore
get
that?
so frustrated with Day of the Dead because I've only been in Mexico once during it, because I'm teaching and I'm in the middle of midterms right now in fall semester. And it's just really difficult to get away to go for that. I was able to do that once. And the irony is my wife, again, is from the western state of Michoacan, and the two most renowned states for their very colorful Day of the Dead commemorations are Michoacan and the southern state of Oaxaca. And so I'm very frustrated that I haven't been able to go more. Yeah, I mean, sometimes I'll go to events depending where I am. I haven't built, I haven't set up a home altar, although maybe I should now because my father died on Christmas Day last year. So um, this might be a good time to start doing that. But the interesting thing, talking about Day of the Dead, in fact, I just did a workshop on Day of the Dead for uh, the same outfit that does WitchCon just last week.
Yeah, spectral evidence. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Were you there too?
Yes, I was. It was
Yeah, okay.
fantastic. Great
Okay.
adventure. Yep.
Yeah, yeah. So I presented on Day of the Dead last Saturday, and one of the interesting things that I point out is that so my wife, even though she's from Day of the Dead epicenter, state of Michoacan, she grew up not really participating in it. They would go to the graveyards more as tourists, as observers, because it was kind of a more working class, rural phenomenon at that time. But after Coco, the Disney Pixar movie Coco goes viral and breaks box office records around the world, then a lot of Mexicans, including some of my relatives in Mexico, for the first time start doing home altars because, Coco made it trendy and fashionable. So, really interesting that kind of Hollywood and also globalizing influence because, and so now like middle class and well-heeled Mexicans will join in the parade, Day of the Dead parades they have and everything. Whereas before they might even, look down on it and deride it because it was basically seen as a more working class phenomenon.
That's very, very interesting. How media has sort of changed even the average perception of things for the everyday a Mexican as well.
Yeah, even the huge parade they now hold in Mexico City was inspired by the James Bond film Spectre. Have you seen that?
Yes, I have.
And
Yes.
that starts off with a 10-minute parade with the giant skeleton puppets and all that. And in the next year, Mexico City started to do what is now an annual parade. So that, as I point out in a Religion for Breakfast episode I did, it's really a case of life imitating art, right? Because it's actually inspired by the James Bond film. So yeah, so these days there's just so much kind of interplay with film and social media and everything is globalized. And going back to Santa Muerte, another reason Santa Muerte has grown so fast and gone global so fast is that she goes public in 2001 in Mexico City, just at the time when social media is starting to explode. And so Facebook, Instagram, and now TikTok have been really, really important platforms for her continued expansion. I actually am the administrator of a Facebook group with some 6,000 members called Devoted to Death, named after my book, although I didn't found the group and I didn't name it. But there, devotees will share pictures of their altars. They'll ask each other questions and everything. And they're Mexicans and there's Europeans and there's African Americans and there's Asian Americans and there's a fair amount of Poles and Italians. And so these social media platforms have just been really powerful engines of her growth as well. When when I was doing the final research for the new edition of my book on TikTok, I did a search of Santa Muerte, and you know how many hits I got for Santa Muerte on TikTok? You're not going to believe this. 2.2, not million, billion.
Oh my God.
2.2 billion hits when I searched Santa Muerte. And this is a year ago. Now it's probably doubled. So yeah, and so there's thousands of accounts on Santa Muerte. They fight with each other, they diss each other, they threaten each other. So yeah, social media has just been really important to her growth and particularly globalization.
Yeah, yeah. And then part of me is wondering too whether this is an opening of acceptance that may be occurring too with death itself. People are now talking about it. We've got death doulas, death walkers. It's no longer sort of hidden. It's a natural part of life, and now is part of her rise. Also, this
Yes, I'm
also
so glad.
going through COVID too, and it was right in our face, especially for us Westerners who aren't faced with, say, in Mexico with the drug cartels and things like that. It's just like
And
this growing awareness.
yeah, that's an excellent point. Are you familiar with the death positive movement?
Yes, yes.
Okay, that was started mostly by American and British women, professional women who work in the death industry. A lot of them are morticians, for example. And the really interesting thing is that the Americans disproportionately come from Southern California. Los Angeles is the second largest Mexican city, or is the city with the second largest Mexican population in the world. Only Mexico City has more Mexicans than Los Angeles, i.e., Los Angeles has a larger Mexican population than the cities of Guadalajara, Monterrey, other Mexican large cities. And so LA is the epicenter of Santa Muerte devotion and of Mexican influence too. So I am very certain that many of these American professional women hailing from Southern California have been profoundly influenced in their attitudes on death by Mexican culture, which always has had kind of a more holistic view of death, and has this unique death culture. Well, and which used to exist in the West as well. I mean, it's really only the past century and a half, depending where you're looking at, in which death kind of became um, segregated and something we went on to talk about. And here in the United States, death kills the American dream because Americans need to live forever and all that. So yeah, I think it's really most importantly Mexican cultural influence that has led to a good chunk of Americans to adopt new, broader, more holistic views on death. Mexicans will often complain about American cultural imperialism, and I'm not saying this is Mexican cultural imperialism, but there's great Mexican influence here in the United States. It goes both ways. For the past 20 years, Americans consume more salsa than they do ketchup. Ketchup is on the decline. Yet I have relatives in Mexico who ruin their eggs by dousing ketchup on it. Um, so the Mexican influence in first Americans and then maybe Europeans and Australians rethinking the way they view death, I think is really pivotal.
Yes, wonderful, wonderful. And I would love to continue our discussions, but I do understand what we are running out of time and you do have other engagements, Andrew. So firstly, thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk about Santa Muerte, death, your books. That sounds really fascinating. All the links will be below. And is there any other way or anything else you would just like to say before we completely wrap up this chat?
Yeah, I mean, you got my mind on COVID, and that that's a really good point because so many of us were touched by friends or family members or people in our social networks uh, who died. I mean, a million a million Americans died, a million Mexican died. I don't know the figure for Australia, but yeah, I mean, it was mass death that kind of, I mean, obviously not on the scale of the Black Plague that sent about a third of Europeans to an early grave. So, in that context, I co-authored an article on how Santa Muerte was becoming even more popular in Mexico as folks petitioned her for both protection from COVID, because at first you had the then president of Mexico was a COVID denier. He wouldn't even wear a mask in public and everything, just as Trump was in the United States. And they took a long time to access the vaccine and such. And so a lot of people only had the supernatural to look for protection or healing. So Santa Muerte, they even came out with a new votive candle, COVID-19 Santa Muerte, to ask for protection, or if you've already been plagued by it, for healing from it too. So yeah, I think also the experience of the pandemic of COVID-19 um, led a fair amount of folks to reflect on death, particularly because so many of us were in lockdown, right? So you had maybe more time for reflection than you usually did because you're locked down in your home, right? So I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, that was, I think, a pivotal time that also led a lot of folks to kind of recalibrate the way they view the end of life.
Yes, because it was in our face, basically. It was in our face. We had regular, daily, monthly, minute updates, unfortunately, of people who've lost their lives, people who are in intensive care. And it wasn't like the wars tend to be in a lot of us Western countries outside, away from us, but this was in our face. And I think it brought our mortality to the forefront, which,
Exactly.
yeah.
Right. And yeah, and maybe we can conclude with this. So underlying a lot of what we've been discussing today is the concept of memento mori, right? Remember death, which was a really important Catholic theme during the Middle Ages in Europe. And I don't know if you visited like any of the bone chapels in Italy or Portugal. Yeah, I mean, those are fantastic displays and hit you in the face with, okay, you're gonna look like us soon, right? In skeletal form. And so, as you know, the concept of memento mori has even it's come back and become trendy lately. There even was an American nun on, I don't know what happened to her. She was on Twitter, now X, who every day would post stuff about, I think she kept a ceramic skull on her desk for reflection to remind that she's skull and bones and everything. And the Catholic Church, to a certain extent, is embracing this, particularly as it's become trendy with Gen X and Millennial and Generation Z. So I think Santa Muerte is also, jibes with that how can you not remember your own mortality when you look at her iconography, right? Because she's a skeleton and she's staring you in the face. So yeah, I think this concept of remember death, um, with the goal of living a better life and
Yeah.
living more in the moment and the present. And that's I'm a Latin America specialist. All my publications have been on Latin America. And that's one of the great early life lessons I learned from Latin America, is to really live for the moment, embrace the moment. Not that you shouldn't have some kind of plan for the future, but we never know when our time has come. We never know when holy death is going to come with her scythe and take you wherever your final destination or eternal destination is. And so that idea of live for the moment, obviously there's a Christian context to it, but there's also, originally it was a pagan context.
Mm.
Eat, drink, and be merry, because you never know when your time is going to
Mm.
come, right? I mean, that was the old kind of Roman and Greek memento mori.
Yeah, I'm also sort of thinking of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which when you actually read it, it's about yes, this whole, or you're just saying, this whole concept that um, this incarnation, this life is limited. In order to have a good death, we were talking about good death. It's like we've got to have a good life as well, but we've got to accept that, yeah, everything's cyclic.
Right.
So,
And that goes back to the kind of um, inextricable intertwining of death and life, the holistic view of it, right?
which ties in right back to what you're saying originally for the indigenous peoples all around the world. Everything was cyclic.
Exactly.
So I think we are running out of time, Andrew. It's been an absolute delight speaking with you. Thank you very much for talking about the magic in you and sharing your knowledge on Santa Muerte. And the links are below for anybody wanting to learn more and reach out to you.
It was my great pleasure, Francis. I really appreciate your early rising at 6 a.m. over down under, as I'm starting to fade away late afternoon here. And yeah, I really appreciate the thoughtful and intelligent questions that always makes for great podcast interviews. So thank you so much.
You're welcome, Andrew. Thank you.